I'm Graham Hancock, and I write books. I'm not a scientist, I'm not an archaeologist. My background is in journalism. I'm best known for a number of books. Perhaps the best known is Fingerprints of the Gods. I presented the Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse. I wrote a number of books on current affairs issues. I wrote a book about the Great Famine in Ethiopia that took place in 1984 called Ethiopia, the Challenge of Hunger. I wrote a book about the disease AIDS, AIDS, the deadly epidemic, with a co-author that was published in 1985. As this went on, I was becoming more and more immersed in the technique and the craft of writing books. It was clearly where I belonged, rather than in writing 300-word articles for the Economist. And I think the first big book that I really did was called Lords of Poverty, and the subtitle was The Freewheeling Lifestyles, Power, Prestige and Corruption of the Multi-Billion-Dollar Aid Business. And in this I was able to unfold all the horrors that I had seen surrounding foreign aid. When I wrote that book, it expressed a side of my nature which is contrarian. I do find myself often on the opposite side of the fence to the majority, and that was the case with foreign aid. And it was that same contrarian view of the world that led me ultimately to question archaeology and the institution of archaeology, which has been a fundamental theme in many of my better-known books since then. I think archaeology is a large bureaucratic institution as well. There may be some wonderful archaeologists, some brilliant individuals, really, really good people, but the institution is what takes precedence. The institution is what controls and demands of its members' behavior in a certain way. And in that sense, it's not too different from the foreign aid bureaucracies. So back in the 80s, I was critiquing foreign aid. Now in the year 2023, I'm critiquing archaeology. It was a process, you see, because that work that I was doing traveling around Africa, and particularly Ethiopia, introduced me to Ethiopia's claim, bizarre though it may seem, to possess the lost Ark of the Covenant. And I eventually wrote a book about that, and that was the book that immediately followed Lords of Poverty. Lords of Poverty was my last current affairs book, and from that I went on to write The Sign and the Seal, Quest for the Lost Ark of the Covenant. It was published in 1992. And it was because of the build-up of experience in the Horn of Africa and learning stuff that a lot of other people didn't know that I began to take Ethiopia's claim to possess the Ark seriously and investigate it in depth. I immediately found myself up against archaeologists who said, of course, it was rubbish. The Ethiopians had made the whole thing up. It was a complete fantasy. I don't think it's a fantasy. I think there's a lot of truth to the Ethiopian story. And I tried to pay tribute to that truth, and I tried to document it thoroughly in The Sign and the Seal. And that's what put me, I think, on the track that led me to write Fingerprints of the Gods. That and the happy coincidence of discovering a book called Hamlet's Mill round about the same time. This background put me on the track of investigating the possibility of a lost civilization. I think life is always a process. You know, there aren't any sudden moments. I didn't just suddenly get interested in the idea of a lost civilization. It happened because I came across evidence that was hard to explain within the existing paradigm. I would say most archaeologists are in it for the love of it. They believe in what they're doing. I don't see them as conspiracists out to get me, although they think I do, but I don't see it that way. I see a bunch of people who sincerely believe in what they're doing and who aren't very well paid. I see the central problem as being twofold. Firstly, that archaeologists do honestly believe that they have the truth about the past. And secondly, for some reason, and this is probably true in many other walks of life as well, archaeology as an institution wants to control the narrative about our past. They therefore discourage people from thinking for themselves. They encourage rather groupthink, where we fit in with the ideology of the institution to which we belong. And that is certainly true of archaeology today. There's a great deal of groupthink in archaeology and an unwillingness to consider alternatives, and a tendency to use the language of propaganda, pseudoscientist, pseudo-archaeologist, to hopefully get rid of opposing narratives, to define an opposing narrative as false science. That's what pseudoscience means. The moment you stick that definition on it, you know, you're already prejudicing people against it. That's why I object to Wikipedia and the way that Wikipedia treats me, because they are always labeling me as a pseudoscientist or a pseudo-archaeologist. And an encyclopedia shouldn't be making judgments like that. It's fine to say a proponent of controversial theories, but to say a proponent of pseudoscientific theories without demonstrating what's actually pseudoscientific about them, which is what Wikipedia does. And Wikipedia is the first port of call for virtually anybody who's heard something, oh, that's interesting, let's find out more. But actually it's an instrument of propaganda, and it's monopolized, certainly in my case, and the case of others, colleagues of mine who work in this field. We know that Wikipedia entries are biased and dishonest, and that they're run by groups of people who in some cases have been opposing our work for decades. And that's not how an encyclopedia should work. It should not make judgments. It should present bare information and allow people to make judgments for themselves. So I'm very familiar with that in my field, and I suspect if it's true in my field, it's probably true in every other field as well. In other words, don't trust Wikipedia. It's not a reliable source. This is part of of an ongoing effort to control the narrative. If you have a critic, and if that critic has some level of popularity and some level of outreach, then the first thing you do as a narrative controller is try to get that person cancelled in one way or another. You know, try to get them written off, and that's certainly happened with me. But I should celebrate that. I should feel it shows that I'm doing something right. For example, the Great Sphinx of Giza, and the very definite evidence of a long exposure to a period of very heavy rainfall that it bears, and also its astronomical orientation. There are a number of factors about the Great Sphinx that strongly suggest we should challenge the date of 4,500 years ago that archaeologists like, and we should much more willingly consider a much older date of perhaps 12,500 years ago. But archaeology says that isn't evidence. We don't look at that. That's not our thing. They just rule it out at the outset without considering it. So at one level, it's defining what may or may not be accepted as evidence. And then at another level, there's the fact that there's so much of the world that archaeology hasn't looked at and really needs to look at before it can claim to have a whole picture of our past. And I hope I've played a useful role in challenging archaeology on this issue. Although I say my methods are journalistic, and they are, in the sense that I will thoroughly research a subject, I will get my boots on the ground, I will interview anybody and everybody who's relevant to the story. I'm also an advocate, and perhaps journalists aren't supposed to advocate particular points of view, although they all do secretly. I'm an advocate for the possibility of a lost civilization of the Ice Age. Human nature is malleable, but we tend to get stuck in the patterns of thinking and the ways of behaving that we're born with and that we're brought up within. There is a tendency for large bureaucratic organizations to form. In a weird way, bureaucracies themselves develop personalities. They become entities, and they become entities that are intent on self-preservation and on perpetuating their own goals. Bureaucracies also thrive when there's an absence of independent thinking on the part of the citizens, where people are persuaded to accept the point of view of our leaders, whoever they may be. The very thought that we need to be led seems to be sort of drummed into us from the moment of birth. But I'm not sure that we do. I'm not sure that human beings do need leaders. We may need some minimal level of organization, but the notion of leadership is a very bizarre one, which often is based on the personality and ego of the person who becomes a leader. And if you look around the world today, there are a number of sources of the major problems in the world today. But one of them is certainly leadership, very, very bad leadership. And then, of course, the mainstream religions, which are themselves large bureaucracies, they're responsible for a lot of the chaos and horror in the world today as well. Based on the absurd notion that any one religion claims that it is absolutely right and every other one is absolutely wrong. And this leads to this very often very aggressive, very controlling behavior in the name of religion. And in fact, people get so easily hoodwinked by ideas that are put forward by leadership figures that when I think of conflicts, not just today, but over the last 1,000+ years, the three big monotheistic faiths, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, have been at the heart of many of them, in one way or another. So I'm not a big fan of the big religions, which are also big bureaucracies. Being alive is a mystery, and there is no universal truth. There's only inquiries into truth, and religions shut those inquiries down. They create a structure in which the priest or the rabbi or the mullah is the voice of authority and which others listen to. And I think that's very unhelpful. I think we need to migrate as a species beyond that level where we start actually thinking for ourselves. It's beginning to happen. There is a resistance to so-called experts in our society today. Science is another one of those big bureaucracies that dominates world thinking. In many ways, in the 21st century, it's become a kind of world religion, the religion of science. And it's enough to say, oh, science says this is so. For most people to say, oh yeah, this is so, without questioning it. So I do think it's a function of human nature. I do think it's a function of large and complex societies, but the tendency to select leaders and to form large bureaucracies has by and large been very unhelpful to the progress of the human race. And if we're going to progress further, we need to move away from that model, much more in the direction of individual thinking. Freedom of thought is something that everybody would vote for, but actually freedom of thought is very restricted in our society, simply by the information that people receive and the information that's shut out. The last ice age is a particularly mysterious period. It's very recent. It ended less than 12,000 years ago. And in terms of human culture, that's very recent. In terms of geology, it's yesterday, you know. There's no doubt that something very bad happened to the world at that time. It's an episode called the Younger Dryas. An episode of Cataclysm, an episode of suddenly rising sea levels, an episode of large-scale animal extinctions. I tend to look at that period, which I think the Great Sphinx dates back to 12,500 years ago, as a time when a former civilization came to an end. There were survivors. They passed on something of their knowledge amongst the people whom they settled with. We need to recognize that this was a very, very major global event that happened right at the dawn of what we think of as civilization. And I would suggest that that's not the dawn, that's a false dawn, that's a restart, that's a reboot of something that existed earlier. But let's suppose the comet impact theory is correct. And the Taurid meteor stream is the likely culprit in the case of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The Earth passes through the Taurid meteor stream twice a year. It takes the Earth 12.5 days to cross it on each crossing, which I and my colleagues, and particularly the team behind the Comet Research Group, the team behind the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, are very worried about the Taurid meteor stream and don't understand why so little attention is being paid to it. If the human race today were to choose to put aside all the unnecessary wars and wickedness that go on, if we were to disinvest from military spending, after all, we say that our military spending is designed to keep us safe, but actually what it's really designed to do is to make war on others. That's all military spending is for. It's about funding warfare. And we as a species devote enormous amounts of money to funding warfare. Warfare that is actually quite capable of wiping out the human race. I mean, a nuclear exchange, which is perfectly possible in the global climate today, would be the end of civilization as we know it. And yet the lunacy of these terribly bad leaders who are running the world could actually lead us into that precipice just through their own ego and stupidity. If we actually want to protect this beautiful planet of ours and keep it going for our children, not turn it into a barren wasteland. That's what happens when you have a fragmenting comet that makes impacts all over the Earth. If we cooperated as a species, if we put all the best minds of all the human beings together and all the wealth that humanity possesses, we could definitely prevent the next asteroid collision. There's no doubt about it. It's well within our technological grasp, but it doesn't appear to be within the grasp of our consciousness. We seem unable as a species to make big decisions like that on a planetary scale. And there are a number of big decisions on a planetary scale that need to be made, and asteroid impact is one of them. I need to be clear, I'm very much against governments. I'm not in favor of governments. I think they're a bad thing, and therefore I'm doubly not in favor of a world government. I'm not in favor of anything like that. But what I am in favor is an elevation of human consciousness to the level where we don't think in these terms anymore. I don't see why should I feel especially proud or virtuous because I was born in Britain. I didn't do anything to be born there. I was just born there. It's no merit of mine. If there is any merit in Britain, and I don't see much, if there is any merit, I can't possess it or claim it. And that's what nationalism seems to do. It seems to say, my culture is the best culture in the world. I love my culture. Well, I'm in favor of human diversity and the diversity of cultures, but I'm not in favor of saying my culture is better than yours and I'm going to destroy your culture, which is what nationalism tends to lead to at the moment. So there's a whole state of mind which humanity needs to transcend at the moment, and I'm not sure how that's going to happen. Bureaucracy is a product of that state of mind rather than necessarily a cause of that state of mind. I'm not sure how it's going to happen. Ayahuasca, maybe. A great many people who want to be leaders wouldn't want to be leaders anymore. If they had 10 sessions of ayahuasca, the chances are they would be so radically transformed as individuals that they wouldn't want to lead anymore. They might want to guide, they might want to help, they might want to give advice, but they wouldn't want to lead and control anymore. And secondly, those who did stay in leadership roles would tend to be much more open-minded and much kinder towards others. One of the things that ayahuasca does, it does many things, but one of the things it does is it opens your heart, and it lowers your barriers to other people. You begin to empathize with other people in a way that you didn't do before. It's a most peculiar thing. There's a great deal of moral teaching in the ayahuasca experience. I've had quite a lot of experience with ayahuasca over the years, and many of the sessions that I've had have been to do with issues in my life where I may have expressed anger. I may have said harsh words that really hurt and damaged another person. And I may have just said them in a spur of the moment in a state of anger. And then what ayahuasca does is it shows me that moment, and it shows me how it felt for the other person. And I feel the pain that my words caused. And it makes me not want to do that anymore. It makes me want to think about how I function in relation to other people. And I can only think that would be a good thing for anybody in the business of governing a country. To have that experience, and also just to break out of the very limited, narrow, confined mindset that we find ourselves locked into in our society today. I mean, we praise our society. That's undoubtedly the case that there's been very significant technological advances, many of which are very good. I'm walking because I have 2 artificial hips. I wouldn't be walking if I didn't have those. I'm walking because I had a disc fused when I was 32 years old. I lost the use of my legs. Science put me back on my feet. You know, I welcome a lot of those things are good, but they're not the be-all and end-all of everything. And the scientific religion, this mindset that everything can be reduced to matter. So that's why scientists like Richard Dawkins will tell you with great confidence that there's no such thing as the soul and there's no such thing as life after death. Well, that's not a scientific statement. Actually, what Richard Dawkins is doing there is stating his own religious belief. It's a rather dark and limited religious belief, but he believes that there's nothing to life, no meaning, no transcendent mystery, that we're just accidents of biology and chemistry. That is not a fact. That is a belief system that he's expressing there. And I think that's been a very harmful and damaging belief system for the human race in the 20th and the 21st century. And I think ayahuasca and other psychedelics would help to break out of it. But of course, a world in which those who wish to be elected to public office were required to have 12 sessions of ayahuasca is very unlikely to happen. It's very unlikely to happen. And then you have to ask yourself, why actually were psychedelics demonized in the first place under Richard Nixon and back to the so-called pernicious, wicked thing called the war on drugs? This was all about controlling public perceptions, and it was based on a realization that psychedelics, whatever else they may do lead people to ask questions that they didn't ask before. They do lead to a questioning state of mind. And of course, the big bureaucracies and the big governments that run our society don't want us asking questions. They want to answer all the questions for us and simply tell us what to think. So in that sense, I think psychedelics can be liberating. But it's important to be clear, psychedelics, whether ayahuasca, whether DMT in the pure smoked form, whether LSD, whether psilocybin, they're all very serious business. They're something that should not be undertaken lightly. They're something that will require of you deep personal inquiry and may put you through very difficult ordeals from time to time. So nobody should leap into the psychedelic experience just rushing. It should always be undertaken gradually and carefully with a great deal of research and in the right setting and the right company.